Welcome to Croxden Abbey, an ancient site nestled in Staffordshire's serene countryside. In the year 1176, this abbey came into being through the vision of Bertram de Verdun, a Norman noble with strong ties to the village of Alton. He was the Lord of Alton, and in 1176 he generously granted lands in both Croxden and Cotton to a group of monks from the Cistercian Abbey in Normandy. These monks, renowned for their strict adherence to the rule of St. Benedict, which dates back to the 6th century, were often referred to as the White Monks. They did originally settle in Cotton, but in 1179 they made the decision to relocate to the more secluded Croxden site, and here they started to construct the abbey. They began with the construction of the church, and over time, under the leadership of Abbot Walter London, who served from 1242 to 1268, the abbey's structures were completed and expanded upon. The Cistercians were known for their white habits, and they sought a life of austerity and devotion. And at Croxden, the commitment was embodied in the careful balance of prayer, work, and study. Can you imagine how incredible this place must have looked in its prime? As we wander through the ruins, we can observe the characteristics of early English Gothic style in its design. It's particularly evident in the pointed arches and ribbed vaults of the church. Croxden would have been home to about 70 Cistercian monks at the height of its time, and it was a completely self-sufficient abbey, which was a typical trait of Cistercian monasteries. The monks here were skilled in sheep farming, and the wool from Croxden was very highly valued. Their advanced agricultural practices, efficient water management, and milling operations underscore the role in England's medieval economy. But life at Croxden was not without its darker moments. In 1380, the abbey was shaken to its core by the murder of Abbot Nicholas, a crime perpetrated within these very walls. The culprit, driven by greed and jealousy, was his own chaplain, an event that scarred the abbey's history. And there are stories in local folklore, like the story of King John, Robin Hood's famous adversary. According to historical accounts and local lore, after King John's death in 1216, his body was buried at Worcester Cathedral, but his heart was supposedly removed and interred at Croxden Abbey. The reasons behind this separation of his heart from his body and the choice of Croxden Abbey for a burial are a matter of speculation. The part of the abbey that we're in now is the cloister, and this was at the centre of monastic life. The monks would have studied at desks, in the covered walkways, and the grand processional door would have provided access to the church. The church now, however, unfortunately, has a road running through where it would have completely stood. But you can still get an idea of how magnificent this whole area was just by looking at the architecture. The road running through the middle is because after the dissolution of the monasteries, this was turned into a farm, and this was a track that ran all the way through that over time has just turned into a road. Now at the end of the church stands this incredible, huge window, and this window at the time was the largest in England. And despite its ruinous state, we can imagine the grandeur of this window, and we're standing in now what would have been the church. Can you imagine the light seeping through that window, creating a kaleidoscope of colours on the stone floor? This part of the abbey, the church, took more than 30 years to complete. And the wall alongside the window is probably part of the early structure, which was before the monks actually arrived in 1179. And when Henry VIII destroyed all of the abbeys, the roof of the church was removed so that the monks couldn't use it anymore. The church was at the centre of monastic life, and there was a series of 8 services held every day and night. Over the years, Croxden Abbey grew and developed, acquiring lands and establishing granges across Staffordshire and Derbyshire, and this expansion facilitated the abbey's economic growth and allowed it to exert influence in the region. The spiritual life at Croxden would have been rigorous and disciplined, with an emphasis on communal prayer and reading and manual labour. The abbey served as a centre of spiritual influence in the region, attracting both lay brothers who handled most of the physical labour and choir monks who focused on more religious duties. This is the South Range, and the range originally housed the stairs to the dormitory, the warming house, the refectory and the kitchen, and throughout the years these rooms were subject to many alterations, including the insertion of later fireplaces and windows, and up the stairs would have been the dormitories where the monks lived. It's hard to imagine, when you stand in a ruin like this, what it would have looked like with the floors above. But there are plenty of signs and drawings and maps as you walk around the ruins that help give you a sense of what it was like when it was used by the monks. There are still parts of the abbey that can give you an idea of what it was like when it was on different levels. As you walk through this passageway, the dormitories would have been above. And there would have been lots of these passageways throughout the abbey, taking you from one place to another. The abbey was constructed using local stone, which not only made the building process more manageable, but also gave the abbey a distinct regional character. And the use of local materials was a common Cistercian practice, reflecting their ethos of simplicity and self-sufficiency. Throughout time, the abbey saw various adaptations and additions, and these changes were often made to accommodate the growing number of monks, or to repair and improve the existing structure. But despite its Gothic features, the abbey's design retained the Cistercian preference for simplicity and functionality. The decoration was minimal compared to contemporary religious buildings. The idea was a simple, beautiful, but functional place of prayer and work. The monks here were skilled in water management, constructing ponds, channels and mills. And the mills were an important source of income, as they provided milling services to local farmers. And Cistercian monasteries, including Croxden, often held monopolies on local milling, which was a lucrative business. There is some evidence to suggest that the monks at Croxden were involved in iron smelting. The Cistercians were among the first in Europe to use water-powered technology for iron production, and Croxden Abbey could have been part of this innovative industrial activity. We do know that iron smelting was happening from very early on at Alton, so there's a good chance that this actually happened. The abbey also engaged in trade and commerce, selling surplus agricultural produce such as wool and possibly other goods like iron and stone. They would also earn revenue by offering hospitality services. Travellers, pilgrims, and sometimes even local nobility would seek lodging and sustenance at the abbey, contributing to its income. We're now in the abbot's lodging, and the abbot was the leader of the monks and the lord of the manor. Important guests would have been entertained in these lodgings, which was very similar to a lord's house, with a screened passage and hall and a private chamber above. In addition to direct management of lands and production, the abbey would have generated income by renting out lands and properties. These leases and rents provided a steady income stream, crucial for the abbey's financial stability. These surviving stones are upright stones, and they're table legs, evidence that this area, which is the infirmary, was used for eating, and sleeping accommodation was probably provided on the floor above. Infirmaries and medieval monastic life were essential. They served as a place where sick and elderly monks received care, and it would have been a quiet place, somewhat separated from the rest of the monastery. There are some great examples of architecture here at Croxden Abbey, and this abbey is managed by English Heritage, and it's completely free to come and have a look. This building in the middle of the abbey is a modern addition. and it gives shelter to some of the more beautiful stones that have been found here. The Abbey is a scheduled ancient monument, which indicates its national historical significance in the UK, and that status provides legal protection, ensuring that any alterations or interventions are carefully controlled to preserve its historical integrity. Regular archaeological surveys are conducted to assess the condition of the site and to inform conservation strategies, and if any repairs need to be made. The chapter house at Croxden Abbey, like in many monasteries, was located off the cloister through a covered walkway that connected the various parts of the monastery. It was an important building where the monks gathered daily to conduct business, listen to readings from the monastery's rule, confess sins and receive instructions. In terms of architecture, Cistercian chapter houses were usually rectangular, with an emphasis on simplicity and functionality. The interior would have been suitably plain, and there would have been seating along the walls for the monks, and at one end there would have been a space for the abbot or the monk that was leading the meeting. The focus was creating a space conducive to reflection and communal decision making. We are so lucky to have so much of this beautiful ruin left, so we can see where these monks lived, where they worked, and where they worshipped. This part of the Abbey is my favourite. It's my favourite part of the ruins, and it would have definitely been my favourite part of the Abbey when it was still standing. This is the book room and the sacristy. Now, this room was originally split in two by a solid wall, and one side contained the book room, where all the books and scriptures and things were stored horizontally in wooden cupboards, and the sacristy at the other end would have held vessels and had its own altar. The book room, which was also often called the scriptorium, was where the manuscripts were copied, written, and sometimes illustrated. This room was vital in the Middle Ages, especially in places like Croxden Abbey, because monasteries were amongst the few places where literacy was maintained and books were produced and preserved. Given the Cistercian order's emphasis on manual labour and simplicity, the scriptorium at Croxden Abbey would have been functional, with an emphasis on the spiritual aspect of copying the texts as a form of devotion. The dissolution of Croxden Abbey in 1538 was part of a larger event known as the Dissolution of the Monasteries, initiated by King Henry VIII. This movement, which occurred between 1536 and 1541, involved the systematic closure and dismantling of monastic institutions across England, Wales and Ireland. As we head across the road to the other part of the Abbey, you can see the ruins here of the high altar. The foundations show that it was very unusual, and the east end of the church was semicircular. It was quite unusual in English Cistercian churches and was probably inspired by the French designs familiar to the patrons of the Abbey, the Verdens. These stone coffins are actually the tombs of the founding family and other benefactors, and in the 14th century, abbots preferred this part of the church for burial rather than the chapter house. The use of a stone coffin was often a mark of high status, and the coffins were simple in design, again reflecting the Cistercian values of austerity and humility. However, constructing these would have been a skilled task. The high stone vaults that would have ceilinged this end of the church would have been very grand, and they must have been very expensive. And from here to the big window that you can see over there is how big this church would have been. After the dissolution at Croxden, the lands, buildings and movable wealth were seized by the Crown, and the roof was removed from the church, and it was actually then used to keep farm animals in, and the whole monastery was turned into a farm. In the centuries following its dissolution, the site of Croxden Abbey fell into further disrepair. However, the romantic appeal of the ruins in the 18th and 19th century led to a renewed interest, which leaves us with the beautiful ruins that we all know and love today. Thank you for watching. If you love our local history, then please check out more of my videos and check out my website, the red-haired Stokey.